Okay. All right. Well, thank you for the kind introduction. Thanks for having me as well. Who's heard of New Lab? Anyone? Cool. Well, two people. So we'll start with the basics. Who knows where the Brooklyn Navy Yard is? All right. So we'll start there. So the Brooklyn Navy Yard's 300 acres on the other side of the East River. It's a private parcel of land that's operated by the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation. The campus itself opened in 1804. It's been open for a couple hundred years. And this is building 128, which opened in 1906. The Navy Yard itself, peak of World War II, you had 60,000 New Yorkers who went to work every day in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Brooklyn had dedicated tram lines going back and forth from the Navy Yard to different locations for people to go to work on a daily basis. At the end of the Second World War, heading into the 50s and 60s, the land got passed back to the city. No one was operating as much. I think there was a little bit of like mafia stuff going on and a bunch of pigeons. Not a lot. This building opened in 1906 and is where the Navy built the engines and machine systems for the major battleships of World War I and World War II. USS Arizona came out of this building. USS Missouri came out of this building. Some of the most important pieces of Navy ammunition were built and designed right here in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We got approached by Mayor Bloomberg about 3.5 years ago, actually a little bit more than that, about 4.5 years ago, because the building hadn't been occupied. It had trees growing in it, a few raccoon families, some holes in the ceiling. But the question was, this has been such a key feature of New York, as well as the US's approach to advanced manufacturing and technology. Clearly there's something better than just destroying it and starting over. And so we pitched the idea of bringing together a community of startups and entrepreneurs who work in frontier tech. If you live in New York, you know a lot of single people. I know about 30 or 40 of them. They all tell me there's no single people in New York, but then I know like 30 or 40 of them. It's the same with people building companies in New York and advanced tech and hardware, anything that's bleeding edge. They think they're the only ones. What it turns out is there's lots of them throughout the city. There's just no center of gravity, no convening location, nothing that brings them together. And so David Belt and Scott Cohen, who are the two founders of New Lab, they spent over $65 million, had access to government funding as well as investors to build and open New Lab, which we'll talk about a little bit more just to give you a sense of kind of what we've developed there and what we operate there. But I kind of always like to start with why the hell am I up here? Like just to give you some sense of who I am and where I came from. If you hadn't noticed the accent, I'm Australian, I'm not American. I grew up in Melbourne, left home when I was 17, and I went and traveled the world trying to learn about the hotel industry. I ended up at Expedia in 2001 when it was called Travelscape and spent 9 years building and scaling the Expedia business, first in Vegas. If you're considering moving to Vegas, come talk to me after, don't do it. Then New York, which was much better. We opened our first office in Jersey City and then moved into Midtown later, a few years later. Then I went to London and then Hong Kong and Sydney in Australia and then back to the US. Really just taking the Expedia business around the world, building out the supply teams that were necessary. Then I came back to New York and was lucky enough to join the Gilt Group, Kevin Ryan and his team there, and built a company called Jetsetter, which was a luxury travel site. We sold that to TripAdvisor after 4 years. Then I moved to California, finally got attracted to the warm weather of the West Coast, moved to Oakland, and spent 2.5 years at Airbnb. I started when it was a couple hundred people, left when it was a few thousand. And that's really the end of my first chapter of my career, which is a whole bunch of stuff in travel. And by that point, I'd built up enough of a skill set where people actually wanted me for what I could do, not the industries I knew a lot about, if that makes sense. Like for the first half, people came to me because I knew a lot about the online travel world. And then in this later stage, people started saying, you could probably take your skill set and apply it to any different industry. And that was a big turning point for me in my career. It was first was building skill set through industry knowledge, and the second stage was taking that skill set and applying it to multiple different industries. And so I got a call from someone at Google who said, we want to come talk to you about a project. We can't tell you what it is. You have to sign an NDA and all that fun stuff. And when I eventually got there and did the interviews, they said, we want you to help commercialize self-driving cars. We want you to run operations and strategy and business development, taking what's been an R&D project and figuring out how you can take this technology to market and build a commercial enterprise around it, generate revenue around it. I thought I was being punked. Like, why would anyone want me to build a self-driving car company? But went through a few more interviews, got the job, and spent 3 years there, starting on an R&D project that later became Waymo, Google's self-driving car company. And I was pretty happy there until someone called me about this thing in Brooklyn called New Lab. And the more I learned about it, the more I got interested in coming back to New York. And the main reason is that since opening, there's now 750 entrepreneurs based at New Lab in an 85,000 square foot building. They're building 152 different companies. We've only accepted 9% of the applicants. 1,600 companies have applied to be based in our building from New York, and only 9% of them have gotten in so far. So back to those single people, there's a lot of single people when it comes to the people looking for this type of support. Not only that, but in the first 2 years of operation, there was $400 million of acquisitions that occurred from the building. There was $400 million worth of companies that were built at New Lab that were acquired by other organizations. And so quickly you started to understand that if we give them this community, we give them $8 million worth of prototyping equipment, we give them 750 other entrepreneurs who are great at everything from blockchain, like we just heard about, through AI, indoor farming, autonomous vehicles, biofabrication. We have people growing bricks from mushroom cells, growing leather from collagen, all of these incredible people. What we learned is if you put them together, they help each other. And so many of them have come out of university ecosystems and academic ecosystems like this, and you kick them out of the nest and suddenly they have nothing. They don't have the labs and the facilities they had in academia. They don't have the professors and the advisors. And so what we do is we provide that kind of next level of support to help grow. The average company starts with us with 5 people and leaves when they're 30. The average valuation when we opened was 8 million. Now we're at just north of 30 million per company. And so we have this incredible community that we call the Noah's Ark of frontier tech. There's 1 or 2 of everything in advanced technology. And we'll show you some of the examples as well. By the way, anything sounds off, throw up your hand. This is not just me speaking to you. If you want to learn more about anything, just throw up your hand and we can continue to ask questions as needed. And so we sit right here in the middle. We're the one of few places where a middle woman or middle man is actually really valuable. We convene these entrepreneurs, we connect them to corporations where their product and technology is helpful or relevant. We work with cities. We have a bunch of programs with the New York City government to use the technology we develop to improve the lives of Brooklyn and New York City residents. And then we work with venture, which is we invest in companies, we give them capital to continue to build their organization, as well as connecting them to capital sources as well. Make sense so far? Going too fast? Okay, I'm a fast talker, so you can throw up the hand too if I'm going too quick. The first thing we found was that this entire community, we had New York corporations coming to us and say, how can I get your community of talent to work on my problems? Which was a great proof point. This talent was so good that the corporates knew they couldn't hire it. You want the best computer vision talent. If you're a car rental company, it's unlikely they're going to work with you full time. So we built this innovation studio model that allows corporates to come to us and run 12-month programs where we get the entrepreneurs from New Lab to work on the problem sets that the corporates have identified that we come up with. So we've worked with railroad companies, we can show you some of the examples. We have a studio with Vimson, one of the largest iron mining companies out of India. They came to us and said they want to make improvements in safety in mining, sustainability of mining, improving the yield of mining, but they don't have access to the talent that's working on advanced tech to do this. So we bring these problems to our community, which they can build solutions around with a customer already telling you that this is an important problem to solve. Make sense? When you're an entrepreneur, you're usually building something in hopes that people want it. You're building Spotify in hopes that people don't want to buy CDs. With this approach, you actually have the customer telling you what they want, and you can build it with them in mind. And so the corporate gets this great talent to work on their problem sets. The entrepreneur gets to build a solution worth a lot of money to the corporate in partnership with them versus taking that leap of faith. Make sense? So we now have these active. We have one with IBM from upstate working on algorithms around quantum computing. If you haven't watched a few TED Talks or YouTube videos around quantum, you should. It's mind-blowing, the most positive and negative impacts that quantum computing is going to have on the planet overall. I can get into that over drinks. Railroad, we're working with Union Pacific, one of the largest rail freight companies in the US. And an example with them is we found out during research, they spend north of $200 million a year manually inspecting train line. That a man or a woman is inspecting on a daily basis the train tracks to make sure there's not issues with them that will cause derailments, or as well as looking at undercarriages of trains, because if something gets stuck in there that's going to cause a derailment, that's a big issue. So one of our tracks of work is a computer vision and robotics team building a robotic solution that can inspect track as the train runs over it, instead of spending hundreds of millions of dollars having to walk the train line on an annual basis or a daily basis. We work with Wallenius Wilhelmsen around shipping and freight technology, how we can improve the process of moving large containers around the world. And then also with Avis around mobility. And so the beauty is we build these prototypes and test them in our building, but also in the Navy Yard. We have 300 acres that we get to play with, almost like a sandbox, to test the technology that's developed. We've also built partnerships with government. We have an urban tech studio that built and deployed sensors around downtown Brooklyn that collected data to better inform urban planning decisions. When they closed Fulton Mall for a Christmas fair in downtown Brooklyn, in the past, to figure out how much it disrupted people, they stood there with counters. How many people are going this way? How many people are going that way? We put up sensors that counted traffic, pedestrians, garbage, how long it sat on the sidewalks, how many people were moved into city bikes versus Ubers and taxis, and could provide real valuable data for the New York City government urban planning teams to look at to make decisions around how they build these events in the future and how they make planning decisions. So that's just an example of how we want this technology ecosystem to actually help New York from a way of life and day-to-day perspective. Eric Adams, the Brooklyn Borough President, he wanted to build a larger community in Brooklyn of people working on indoor farming and urban farming. So we received a $1 million grant from Eric Adams, the Brooklyn Borough President, and we're building ag tech facilities so that we can attract companies from around the country and the world to build urban farming systems for New York. One of them is called Farm Shelf. Their system is used by 70 New York restaurants right now, 7-foot vertical farming units, which I'll show you. They grow leafy greens, lettuce, as well as tomatoes, carrots, all in these fridge units that use 96% less water and soil than traditional farming. If you guys eat a salad tonight after leaving this event, that lettuce has traveled between 1,820 and 2,000 miles to get to New York. The best cases it came from California, the worst cases it came from Mexico, and it's traveled even further. These are 70 restaurants that are growing leafy green produce like 5 feet from the kitchen. So an incredible advantage to kind of build the overall ag tech ecosystem in New York. Make sense so far? Cool. We've also done a range of programs from local to federal level, some that we're really proud of. If we start over here on the right, we've launched a high school program and a middle school program with New York City Public Schools, mainly in Brooklyn. We have 250 high schoolers from Brooklyn Public Schools who get paired with New Lab startups to do summer internships around the technology they're interested in. If you're interested in virtual reality, we pair you with those startups. If you want to learn around smart textiles, fabrics that can monitor your heart rate, we'll put you with a company developing that. If you want to work on indoor farming, we've got 7 different startups around ag tech and indoor farming systems. Then we also expanded it to middle schoolers. We took 2,100 middle schoolers this year from Brooklyn Public Schools, and we put them through education experiences around technology. They come build small robots, they scan their heads and 3D print them, they get to work and paint in virtual reality. We just expose them to these other career paths that might be out there for them when they move to college and high school that they may not have considered. And so we've been trying as much as we can to continue to give back to the community around us and give them access to the technology and the brain trust that exists. We've done work on ecosystem development, we mentioned, for the Brooklyn Borough President. We've done innovation studios around urban tech and urban tech for planning with the EDC. We've even worked with the Department of Defense, where we helped design programs to have their own incubators and accelerators in the DoD. And more recently, we ran the hackathon for the Navy in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where they allowed people to hack into the Navy's jet system to see how they could find cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And teams found ways into the Navy system within 72 hours of being a New Lab. So we kind of use this community across both corporate as well as public and private opportunities, if that makes sense. So to give you a little bit of a taste of the types of companies, because I can talk as much as you want, these are the guys that talk for themselves in regards to the technology they're building. Let's start with Occam's Razor. Pure software, not hardware. About 40% of the startups we house are software. Occam's Razor has built a machine learning system that can read and understand medical research papers in any language, whether they're typed or handwritten, and build a knowledge graph so that every researcher around the world studying that medical condition can see what's already been understood and what's already been tested. So there's no duplicative research, right? Like a team in Berlin is doing the same thing as a team in Sydney, as one in London. How do you get them all working in concert with each other? And this is the product that did it. It's funded by the Michael J. Fox Foundation. That's why they're focused on Parkinson's, as well as Sergey Brin, the founder of Google, is their other funder. And they've developed a system that will tell researchers around the world on Parkinson's, this has already been proven. And not only that, it spits out the next level of hypotheses that you need to tackle. If you want to make progress, start looking at these questions, and so they can consistently move researchers in the right direction. Variant Bio, I struggled to get through this without making comparisons to X-Men, but these guys have found 11 families around the world with specific genetic anomalies that they are now studying to create therapeutics and medication around. The first example was a Texan family where one of their members of the family got hit by a car traveling north of 40 miles an hour, had significant brain damage, but did not break a bone in his body. And when they tested his genetic line, his family, his kids, they all had 4 times the bone density of the average human. Then they found an Indonesian family that could hold their breath for 15 to 18 minutes at a time. Decades of fishing and experience that had led to this greater lung capacity. A Sri Lankan family with 10% of the pain receptors of the average human. They were found doing like circus events where they were walking on coals, putting knives through their body, and it was because they just didn't feel pain in the same way you and I would. And so they're studying 11 of these examples to figure out, if your bone density is 1/5 of the average human, how can I understand this family to figure out how I could fix and correct your imbalances, if that makes sense. BioLite, throughout Africa, they've developed and dispersed stoves, wood-burning stoves that have light sockets in the side of them. So you can burn wood and charge laptops, cell phones, computers, anything you need. It's a fire that creates electricity in areas that are off the grid. They generate revenue through selling this to hikers. If you're an outdoors person, not me, but they started with that product, and then they've used a lot of their profits to disperse these products in areas throughout Africa that gives power to people who are off the grid. Seek is in quantum computing. Pliant Energy, they've developed an amphibious drone. Go home and look at YouTube of this. It's a drone that can swim through water, then come out of the ocean, walk on ice or sand or dirt, and can collect data for the Navy. They're solely funded by the Navy. It's an incredible robotic system to watch. And then Farm Shelf was one of the companies we just mentioned with those vertical farming units. A few others, and then we'll move on to talking about the self-driving car side of things. We've got Honeybee Robotics. They've been on 3 Mars missions. They build robotics that can dig on surfaces outside of planet Earth. And most recently, they've deployed a system that is taking samples from moving comets going 20,000 miles an hour and returning back to Earth in 2030 with those samples. They get one shot at blowing high-pressure hydrogen at a comet, taking all the dust that comes off of it, capturing it with almost like a scooper, and then bringing that back to Earth for analysis for the first time ever. And then the last 2 to get us onto our other topic, Carmera, they develop these low-cost sensors that you put on taxis and Amazon delivery trucks, and they go around and build HD maps for self-driving cars to operate on. One of the biggest challenges of self-driving cars is you build maps for them to operate on, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But have you seen how much construction exists in New York? So you can imagine how long that map stays accurate. About 10 minutes before they've thrown up a yield sign instead of a stop sign, they've dug up an intersection. And so they use these swarms of cars, all with these little sensors that will continue to look at changes in the road graph and then update a map real time so that self-driving cars can continue to operate through the region. And the last one is Optimus Ride, the first deployment in New York City of self-driving cars. If you get the shot of the ferry to us, there's a ferry from Wall Street or 34th Street, goes right to our door. You jump off the ferry and you get on one of these self-driving cars and they'll take you to New Lab. So for free, you get to experience self-driving technology right here in New York City if you want to check it out. It doesn't cost anything, and you can drive around the 300-acre private lot of the Navy Yard and experience this technology firsthand, which is really rare. Like, there's not a lot of other self-driving car companies that will let you jump in their car for nothing. So you should totally check that out. And so with that pivot, I thought we'd talk a little bit about self-driving technology. I spent just over 3 years with Google working on it, and it's a product that both people are interested in, fascinated in, and slightly terrified of. And there's a lot of kind of misinformation out there about how the technology works, where it is in its development. And so I thought I'd go through from here just a little bit of self-driving 101. Raise your hand if something doesn't make sense or if you want to double click on any of these topics. But the first thing you have to start with are these levels of autonomy. So if you want to read about self-driving cars, you're going to read about L4 versus L5 versus L3 versus L2. And these are essentially like getting licenses that move you up a level of sophistication. Every car out there is tagged as an L0 through an L5. L0 is my favorite car, is a 1964 Corvette. That's got no automation at all. No robotics, no intelligence, no compute. It's an old classic car. That's an L0 vehicle. Then you move up to an L1. Who's got cruise control in their car? Most of us. Cruise control is an L1 function. The car can handle one function, speeding. It can maintain a speed, and that's it. It doesn't stop and then re-accelerate. It doesn't change lanes. It doesn't take corners. That's an L1 vehicle. Then you get into L2 and then into L3. And so L2 is like my car. You can set cruise control, and it'll keep me in the lane. If the car starts to go outside the lane, it'll pull me back in. And so it's starting to have partial automation. A little bit of steering and acceleration changes combined. Maybe it can shift lanes. Maybe it can stay within a lane on cruise control. But that's about it. Most of them are freeway products. And in L1 through L3, the other key piece is that a driver is needed in the car. You're on duty. If you're in an L1 through 3 car, you're in charge of supervising. You fall asleep and gets into an accident, it's your problem. The car says it doesn't know what's going on and needs your help, and you're not paying attention, your problem. So these are all the early levels of automation you see out there today. Tesla is at an L3 level. You can buy self-driving technology in a Tesla, but it's killed 3 people so far. One who was watching Harry Potter on an iPad. The car asked him to take over. He didn't take over quickly enough. He hit the back of a white truck going 65 miles an hour, and he died in the incident. That is an L3 technology that says you're accepting the liability, you're taking on the risk, you fall asleep. There's been videos of people getting in the right side of the car and letting the car drive itself down the freeways. These are all early dangerous uses of like partially completed automation, if that makes sense. The real prize, what everyone is focused on developing, is these final 2 categories, L4 and L5. The first piece, once you get to L4, it's a car that you can get in and go to sleep. And that's the key factor. You're not babysitting that vehicle. That car can operate and maintain all of the different maneuvering within a specific cordoned off environment. And that last piece is the key piece to L4, within a conditioned environment. So my car, you could get an L4 self-driving car that can drive the island of Manhattan. But once you take it over the bridges or under the tunnels and it wakes up in Jersey, it can't drive there. That's an L4 vehicle. So it can do everything in Manhattan, but nothing once you take it off of Manhattan. And so that's how you know an L4 versus an L5. Is there a limit to its geographic fenced territory that it can operate in? Make sense so far? So when you get to an L5, it means I get in Manhattan, I tell it to go to San Francisco, and that car can drive. It'll take me the entire way across the country. I'll have to refill it with gas or whatever else is necessary. But L5 is that final frontier where all geographic limitations are removed from the vehicle. Sound good so far? If you just took that all in, you are now 90% better than half of the articles out there in the world to talk about this. There's complete confusion around all of these levels of autonomy, what they mean, and you'll already now be able to identify the state of the technology people are trying to sell you. If they tell you you have to keep your hands on the wheel, you're here at best. You're somewhere between 3 and 1. And as we move forward, we'll go up through that as well. So far, so good. So what is the technology that's actually equipped with these cars? And this gives you a little bit of an insight into the infancy of the technology and how early we are in the development. Because what do we use really to drive a car? We use 2 eyes. That's the 2 sensors that are key. I mean, you listen a little bit for audio, you shouldn't wear headphones when you're driving, but the main thing we have are 2 vision sets, 2 cameras. These cars, they have anywhere from 5 to 15 cameras in the large dome on the top, and depending on who the self-driving car developer is. So the first piece is you have a camera set, a computer vision set, which is identifying objects as it's driving around, categorizing them. That's a dog, that's a stop sign, that's a traffic light. It's picking out everything out there in the world and categorizing it through a glossary so that the vehicle knows how to operate. Then you have radar. Radar's technology that's been around for decades. Radars are usually on the 4 corners of the vehicle. They're sending out waves that are bouncing off of objects and coming back. And the speed at which that bounces back is telling the car how far away that is, so it can create a picture of what's around it using the radar feedback that you're getting. And then more recently, this technology of LiDAR has been a huge boom that is beams of light that are shot out from a piece of hardware that bounce off of objects and return really quickly and allow the car to build a map of what's going on around it at any given time. So you typically have long-range LiDAR on the top. The best long-range LiDAR out there right now can see 4 to 5 football fields of length. It can spot a pedestrian 500 yards away versus a human occupant where you're talking 100, 150 yards. So that you're starting to get technology that sees much further ahead, and that's why there are these big ugly domes, the KFC buckets on the top of these cars, is because you need something that can see that length. Yeah.
How does that work
In fog? Fog's pretty good. Snow they've started driving in. You've seen them driving in haboobs in Phoenix, which are crazy sandstorms. So they're getting better and better, but it's a great point, which is one of the major 4 remaining obstacles we'll talk about is weather. Because where are most of self-driving cars being tested today? California and Arizona. Does it snow in either of those? Not really. Does it rain much? Nope. You get sandstorm every once in a while. But you're totally right. The fog is still a manageable issue, but heavy snowfall is still tough, really significant downpours. So they're starting to test these vehicles in dry urban landscapes so that the weather is more predictable. Great question. Then the other key piece, once you've figured out the hardware, so you've got cameras that are looking from a computer vision perspective, you have radars and lidars on the corners, then you get to the compute, which is the next key thing. I just got off of a plane a couple days ago from Singapore, and I watched the latest Fast and the Furious film. Am I the only one stupid enough to watch that? And they had 100 self-driving cars that the baddie took over, and he was driving them all around Manhattan. They were flying off the tops of buildings. The first key piece is that this is not possible the way these cars are designed and developed. The compute, the system that is taking in all these inputs from the hardware and deciding, do I turn left, do I turn right, do I slow down, do I accelerate, that's based in the trunk of the car. It's not something, it doesn't ask the cloud, should I make a left turn, and then a signal comes back and it takes a left turn. It'd be way too dangerous. How many times a day does your cell phone lose reception? Could you imagine if cars were doing that? So these aren't cars that are operating on Wi-Fi, they're not operating on GPS or cell phones or working through the cloud. The processing unit, one of the most powerful mobile processing pieces out there, is in the trunk of the car. And that's what is taking all these inputs live and calculating the decision set on how you maneuver the vehicle. So to penetrate that system, to do the Fast and the Furious thing where you're controlling hundreds of cars remotely, you would have to get in the car and infiltrate that compute system actually in the vehicle. You're not doing it from a remote location because there's no remote kind of decision-making process occurring as these cars are driving. Make sense so far? Then the other fun things becomes, well, what if you get rear-ended and you destroy the compute? So most of these cars have secondary redundant compute systems hidden somewhere else in the vehicle that's a distance away from the main compute. So you can even blow up that computer in the trunk of the car, and a secondary compute system will activate and pull the car to a safe stop, call 911, and allow the police to come and deal with the issue at hand. So the other piece you have to remember is when you're building these technology, you never have a human to catch up on an issue. So how many people have power steering in a car that they own? All of us by now? Yep. Power steering fails every 150 to 200,000 miles per vehicle, depending on the class of vehicle. It'll never happen to most of us. We just don't drive the same car for that long. But if a power steering is lost in a vehicle like this, what happens if you or I are driving? We just pull it over. We just got muscles. It's a little heavier on the steering column, but we deal with it. If you lose the power steering and a computer's driving, where's the muscle? There isn't any. So most of these cars also have secondary redundant power steering systems. So you have to look at every fail-safe of what could go wrong and make sure that none of the solutions involve a human who's supposed to step in and fix the problem. Make sense? Yeah.
Back in bicycles, this track bicycle paths, bicycle lanes.
Bicycle lanes? Yeah. Yeah, the cars operate off of HD maps that are built for the vehicle, not like Google Maps, but certainly significant more detail. And those maps tell it where it can drive. We'll get to it, the biggest risk of this technology being adopted is actually all of us. Because these cars, they're the safest way to get from point A to B, but they're also most likely the slowest.
What if they go out of their lane, bicyclists?
It treats it like any object in the road. I mean, you can roll a ball out and it's going to slow down and stop for that ball. It can be a tree, it can be a squirrel, it can be a bike. It doesn't ignore any object in the road. Its focus is operating as safely as possible under any circumstances. And so these cars, a bunch of the issues we saw in California, the most frequent accident we had was stopping at stop signs. Why? Because the cars behind you were always surprised that you stopped at a stop sign. Literally. The number one accident was rear-ending collisions because people got out and said, I didn't think you were going to stop. Because in California, they call them rolling stops. You kind of like, you may bring it down to 15, but you kind of just meander through. So the number one accident type we experienced was rear-ending collisions from people who just weren't expecting a vehicle to stop at a stop sign. These cars pull over for every ambulance. They stop for every school bus. School buses, if they pull over on the other side of the road, you're supposed to pull over to the right. How many people here do that? All right. These cars actually do it. So the issue you'll see with adoption is that if I can jump in an Uber or a Lyft and they can get me there 10 minutes quicker because they'll run a yellow, they'll ignore a few road rules, they won't stop at stop signs, but the other vehicle will get me there safer, is that worth it to me, or is my time more important? It's going to be an interesting question for people when these roll out for customer adoption. Because the first use case we'll talk about is taxis, and we'll talk about why that is the case. So that's the vehicle itself. Any questions on that side of things? Most of the companies you see are building onto existing vehicles. They're taking Lexus, they're taking Toyotas, they're taking FCA, Pacificas, and they're bolting on hardware, they're adding in compute, they're putting in new wiring harnesses, and then they're rolling these cars out. There's one or two examples that aren't doing that. A company called Zoox is building a car from the ground up. Tesla builds their cars from the ground up. But the majority of the folks you're looking at are actually doing bolt-on into existing vehicles as well. So that brings us to like, who are the players you're going to read about? You really break them down into three categories. You've got the automakers. They see this as an existential threat. What you hear from them is, we don't want to become the handset makers. And that refers to your phone in your pocket. What do you have? You have an iPhone. Who makes an iPhone? Apple. Well, actually, the phone's made by someone else in China. You just don't know who they are. But the software is built by Apple. The design and brand and logo is built by Apple. And so the customer relationship you and I all have is built with Apple. The car set makers don't want to wake up 30 years from now and you're like, oh, my car, it's a Google car. But it's like, no, it's made by Ford. Yeah, but it's got Google software in it. That's who's driving me around. So the car companies across all different spectrums have taken pretty significant steps to try to stay ahead of this race, develop the technology themselves. General Motors paid $1 billion for Cruise, a startup built in San Francisco. Everyone thought they were crazy. Now it looks like it might have been a pretty wise investment early on. Ford teamed up with Argo, which is an ex-Google person who worked on our project, who's now building technology for them at Ford. Volkswagen, Toyota, Daimler all have their own programs. Tesla builds software and allows customers to test it for them and see how they experience the technology. But these are all automakers who are in the race and are developing their own software and hardware to compete in the self-driving world. Then you have the technology players. Waymo is definitely one of the leaders. And a lot of that is because they started a lot far earlier than most people. It's been the self-driving car project at Google's more than 10 years old. Most people started working on this in the last 2 to 3 years. And it also takes years and years of testing and iteration to make progress. And so the way you test these vehicles is you take a car, you put the hardware on it, you've got the compute, you load your first version of the software, just like iOS on your phone or Microsoft Word. They're loading software onto this car, and they're putting a safety driver behind the wheel, and they tell that person, if the car does anything strange, you take over. You just touch the wheel, it disengages, and now it's yours to drive, and you have to avoid any craziness. Every time a person disengages, that car is taking a log and saying, I did something wrong, because the person took over. And so then you go through triage, where software engineers look at those logs and say, okay, did the car actually do something wrong, or was the safety driver just a little nervous and just wanted to make sure everything was safe? If they find the car did do something wrong, they fix that bug, they figure out why it happened, they patch the software, and just like you update your phones once a month with new iOS, they update the cars, and then the cars keep driving. And they keep doing that, time after time after time. 11 years, millions of miles, and over a long journey, the cars start to get perfect. Last year, Google's results was north of 5,000 miles per disengage. So the average car was driving more than 5,000 miles before the human had to do anything. That's pretty good. If you go back 10 years ago, it's probably half a mile per disengage. That the car just coming out of a parking lot, you'd be like, oh, gotta take over and deal with that. And so that's how they continue to test and iterate this software. So it's a long road. There's no way to just skip ahead to be ahead of everyone. You have to take the time to test and iterate software again and again and again. Make sense? So on the technology players, you have Waymo. Zoox is a California startup. They're building companies from cars from the ground up. So they're actually building their own car. Aurora, another spin out from Google. Voyage is based out of Florida. They build self-driving minivans for senior citizen communities. that drive senior citizens from point to point for medical appointments, time at the pool, things like that. And Optimus Ride is in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the one you can go see at any point. And then the last part is that the Lyft and the Ubers of the world see this again as an existential threat. So the average cost per mile nationwide of grabbing a Lyft or an Uber is about $2.50 per mile. So for every mile you drive, you're paying them $2.50 on average. New York, I've seen like $15 to $20 a mile, depending on whether it's raining, but that's the average across the country. 70% of that goes to the driver, and 30% is kept by Uber or Lyft. Like that's their commission, essentially. It goes up and down a little bit, but the general math is there. Now the self-driving car companies, they've said their target is $1 per mile. They want to be able to operate a vehicle at $1 per mile. So if the average is $2.50 a mile for these guys, and the self-driving car operates at $1 a mile, then you could charge $1.50 per mile, be $1 cheaper than everybody, and be keeping that 50-cent margin specifically to the self-driving car company. So these guys are saying there's some point in the future where self-driving cars will have a massive cost advantage over us, that they will be able to provide customers cheaper transportation than we will, and we need to develop this technology to stay relevant and be able to compete at that price point when the technology eventually rolls out. And so you have Uber that has been in the self-driving car development for a while with their team ATG, and then Lyft has level 5, and then Didi, you probably may not have heard of Didi, but Didi's out of China and has done a ton of investment and development on their self-driving stack as well. Make sense? All right. So now we've got, you know what the levels of autonomy are, you got the basis of the tech, you kind of know what's on the cars when you see them driving around. Now is how do you know if there's progress? And so these are the kind of the key things to look for when you read articles about what people are announcing, because people love announcing stuff in self-driving cars. They announce it before they've done it, and what you need to be able to read is like, what is really a step forward, and what is just the same old testing and iteration that people have been celebrating for a while. And so the first part is up here, you have most of the milestones you'll hear about testing. First, there's employee pilots. So they'll announce that they're letting their employees ride in the self-driving cars. You can get to work. I used one every day at Google to go to Starbucks to get my lunch. I would always use the self-driving cars to experience the technology. But the first point is you're comfortable enough to say employees can ride in the car with a safety driver behind the wheel. So you've got a human backup, and you're allowing your employees to experience it. That's the first milestone you typically hear about. Then you see that they allow employees to ride them without safety drivers. And I'll tell you, nothing prepares you for getting in a car with nobody behind the wheel and driving you to your destination. I did this 3-4 times a day for 2 years, and the first time I did this, it was still like one of the most unique experiences of my life. Like I got in a car and told it I wanted to go somewhere for lunch, and it drove there without anyone else in the car. Complete privacy. I had control of the music, the temperature control in the system, could make phone calls. The car was maintained and cleaned. Every car was the same that picked me up. It was amazing. The third time I did it, I fell asleep. I was just like, this is perfect. I don't have to worry about anything. Just wake me up when we get to the destination. And so that's the second piece you'll see, is when they start allowing employees to ride without safety drivers. Then you see them announce public pilots, but with safety drivers. So in Phoenix and in California, and there was also in Austin and Vegas, this is where they'll allow you to sign up. But again, there'll be safety drivers in the car, so you don't jump straight to that experience of an empty vehicle. But the fact that they're allowing you to get in the car is another step forward in their technology. That their safety team, their legal team has said, yes, we're comfortable letting public people into the car. And so that's the next level of milestone you'll occasionally see. And then the last on the testing side is where you allow public people to get in cars without safety drivers. And so this was a big deal that happened late last year with Waymo and the team there, where they started to allow public users in Phoenix to hail a car that would show up with nobody in it, and they would get in it and take it to their destination. And then from there, the next set is commercial rollout. Are they charging money and making money off the technology? And they start with limited paid customers with safety drivers, so I have to pay for my ride, but there's a safety driver, and it's only 1,000 people or 2,000 people. That's the first step on the commercial rollout. Then you see paid public customers without safety drivers. And this happened 3 weeks ago. And it wasn't even announced. You found out, I follow Reddit, the self-driving car board on Reddit, and a passenger in Phoenix posted a photo from his Waymo app because he hailed the car and it popped up and said, just so you know, this car is going to be completely empty. You're going to be driven around by an empty vehicle. And that was the first case we'd seen of this. Well ahead of anybody else, but this is kind of the best status of where we are now, because that's where Waymo is, and they're the leader in regards to the technology itself. So the next thing you see is, do they have all paid customers driving in empty vehicles? And you got to wait for that announcement in a specific geography. So in Phoenix, will they have 1,000 cars driving around, picking up people, and all of them are empty? And then the last piece is they scale it to multiple cities. That now it's in Phoenix, and it's in San Francisco, and it's in Austin. And so these are the next two key milestones people like me who are fascinated by this field are sitting around waiting for. Make sense? Cool. And I know we're close to running out on time, but we'll finish off. So what's left are 4 big problems. And there was a great question before, they already called out one of them. But these are the 4 things that limit the scalability and commercial rollout of how you use this technology. Because the one question I always get is, why are they bothering with taxis? Just sell me one. Like, I don't need a self-driving taxi. I'd rather a self-driving car that I just take wherever I want to go. And the first reason is because these cars operate off HD, high definition, and high density maps that you create of a city, which are incredible level of detail, down to the 10th of a millimeter of the curb height, where each traffic light is positioned, where the stop sign is, what type of intersection it is. Now, maintaining that map across the country, if you wanted a car, you could just jump in and say, go to Vegas. That means there needs to be an HD map of high quality all the way between us and Vegas. It's a pretty significant challenge. We had that one new lab company we talked about, Carmera. They're building a solution to keep these maps up to date using all the cars driving around. But this is one of the major challenges they still have. So the first piece I give you is, okay, we're going to build the commercial rollout. The first thing you have to know is it only can operate in 80 square miles. So you can't most likely sell someone a car and say, here's your $50,000 car. It can only drive in 50 square miles. It can only drive in the island of Manhattan. But that, for now, is that they're building commercial strategies that can be done in a fixed geographic area. Make sense? Cool. Second one was called out as weather. They can't operate in all weather conditions. They can't operate in big snowstorms, haboobs, typhoons. There's a range of weather conditions where the sensors will actually have trouble identifying what's going on out there in the world. And so you need to look at commercial rollouts where the weather is consistent, where it's predictable. You're not going to deal with snow and ice just yet. And so that's, again, why you're seeing most of this testing in Texas and Nevada and California and Arizona. The third one is that it's still damn expensive. The compute, the radars, the LiDARs, the computer vision sets, these are hundreds to $200,000 worth of equipment put onto vehicles. And you still need the technology to improve, the cost to come down. And so if I said to you, oh, you've decided you want to buy a Toyota Corolla? Great, it's $22,000. Would you like it to be a self-driving Corolla? That'll be $222,000. The level of adoption would be 0. No one's going to pay another 200 grand to make their car self-drive. So the result of that is you have to find a use case that can generate revenue to justify that cost, but not be through personal car ownership. And then the last one is that these cars are all operating in more suburban environments today. Chandler in Arizona, Mountain View in California. These are areas that don't look like Times Square. Times Square and Times Square in the snow is the Everest of challenges for self-driving cars. Like, I drive, and I've been driving for 25 years. I'm terrified to drive through Times Square. You imagine a car that will always yield to every pedestrian, will never run a yellow light.
You will knock it down the block.
It would not make it out of Times Square. So that's the next piece, is they still haven't tackled urban environments. They're dealing with suburban environments. So now if I say to you, you have to build a business with a car that drives itself, that can drive in 60, let's say 60 square miles. It can only drive in warm weather conditions and not in snow and ice. It's expensive, so you need to generate revenue as much as you can. 24 hours a day, this car needs to make money. And it can't yet drive in downtown environments. So what's the business you launch first? Taxis. Taxis in warm weather cities, in suburban environments that don't have dense urban environments and don't have crazy weather to deal with. And that's where they're starting. And what they'll be able to do is say to those customers in Phoenix, as an example, you can spend $3 a mile to drive a Lyft, or you can spend $1.50 a mile to drive with us. You can control everything in the vehicle. Every car that shows up is the same car. Every Waymo car has a car seat for children. You set the climate in the app before you get into the vehicle. They're all the same cleanliness. You don't have to worry about the Lyft or Uber driver, who they are, the fact that they know where you live. There's a long list of issues that have happened between drivers and passengers. Those are all eliminated at a reduced cost. And that value proposition will slowly scale as the hardware gets cheaper, as they get sophisticated enough to work in urban environments, as they can work in all weather conditions, and start to work off larger geographic maps as well. Make sense? Yeah?
What fuel do they run on?
It depends which. Each car company has different ones. So you have GM runs on a Bolt, I believe, which is an EV, electric vehicle. Waymo runs Pacificas, which are hybrids, so both gas and electric. Uber is running on Volvos, which are gas, so it depends.
What about the pollution problem? Because it seems like there will be many more cars and one passenger per car, one family per car.
Yeah, certainly self-driving versus not self-driving, there's no pollution difference necessarily, but I think your statement is like, is it better in regards to having lots of Uber, Lyfts, self-driving cars, that approach to car sharing? Which is it, there's studies that suggest both, but it's a fair issue. I think pollution is one, congestion is the other. Is that if you now have 10 companies with self-driving cars that are picking people up, how does that add to traffic? There's already been reports and limits on Lyft and Uber drivers in New York as an example, but it's a good question. And the last piece I'll leave you with is just the question of why. Like, why the hell do we need self-driving cars? So we just talked to you for an hour. 135 people just died on the roads around the world in the last hour. In the US, it's 135 people a day, which is the equivalent of a Delta Boeing 737, one a day crashing. You can imagine all the issues we had with Boeing 737, the MAX, the plane that crashed a couple times. They grounded all of them. This is one crashing every day of every year. And last year was the first time in 40 years where road fatalities went up in the US and not down. We've got cars with airbags in all different directions, emergency braking systems, and we're killing people at a faster rate, not a slower one on the roads. And it's prescription drugs, it's phones, it's distraction in vehicles. So the why is like, there's gotta be a better way than this. And if you look at globally, it's one plane crashing every hour. So about 2.5 million people will die this year on the roads. So the original mission of most of these was there's gotta be a safer way to do this, that we are not very good at driving 2-ton pieces of metal 65 miles an hour. And the hope is certainly that there's a better solution out there. So with that, I think we're right on 8 o'clock, and so I'd certainly open up to any last questions you guys have. Yeah?
So if you were driving on a highway
Yeah.
in the suburbs, does it follow the speed limit of the highways where you can go 50 miles an hour or 60 miles an hour or whatever the speed limit is on the highway?
Yeah, so you can program the vehicles how they behave with speed limits, but every car I've driven in, they're not allowed to drive above the speed limit. So they take it usually to 2 to 3 miles an hour below the speed limit, and they kind of sit at that level, which is, again, another one of the adoption issues. In Mountain View, 35 mile an hour roads, the average speed of a car on those 35 mile an hour roads was 52 miles an hour. So these cars drive 35 in a 35, and everyone else drives 52 in a 35. Causes some problems. Those mixed fleet issues are really challenging, where the car is behaving the way the law says, and the rest of us are behaving the way society has over time told us to
But it
behave.
may also change the speed limits if the cars are safer.
Sure.
Because those speed limits are often there because people are making the speed limit.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you've seen there's legislation in Texas already that's building self-driving car lanes on freeways, where those vehicles will be able to operate at higher speeds. So you could get a car that drives only in a dedicated self-driving car lane, and it's allowed to drive 80 miles an hour because there's not someone, watching YouTube while driving. Yeah.
So I don't even think about social impacts so much in certain respects, but
Yeah.
when you think about these cars, there's about 50,000 Uber cars in New York State alone right now.
50,000 what cars?
50,000 Uber.
Uber, okay.
Right, so when you think about the economic disruption, again, we're near critical mass, I understand that, but still, when you think about moving forward, what kind of mitigation do you have for that economic disruption that's going to occur?
So you're looking at like people driving Ubers who are getting replaced by these?
And other
Totally. Yeah, I think we've seen a few things. So the one example, there's goods and bads. The first case in Phoenix, as an example, is to maintain all these vehicles. They have 6 or 7 depots around Phoenix where they've had to staff up people to clean cars, maintain cars, do the maintenance on the vehicles. And so you do see some job growth around like, where do these cars go? Where are they stored? How are they cleaned? How are they maintained? So there is a new category of jobs that's being created. Whether that balances is definitely not something I've seen so far. The other piece you've seen is Google announced a partnership with Valley Metro, which is an organization in Phoenix that provides subsidies for people for transportation. And the average wait time to get a shuttle bus through this subsidized transportation offering was 3 to 4 hours, and they were paying $10 to $12 a mile. And so if you were someone who qualified for the subsidy and had to go to a doctor's appointment, you had to schedule your shuttle van like 3 to 4 hours in advance. With the reduced cost of operating these self-driving vans, they're able to now pick all these passengers up in a much lower cost vehicle that they now guarantee pickups within 20 minutes, and so they can improve the experience there as well. So there's definitely unproven on the employment side, like how much do the jobs create versus lose. And then if you look at trucking, for example, trucking now is predicting 150,000 job shortage over the next 10 years in the US, that they don't know who's gonna drive trucks around the country because millennials aren't lining up to be truck drivers. And so the technology is actually being welcomed in the trucking industry more than the passenger industry because they're having trouble actually filling the demand for truck drivers. But definitely a fair question. Cool, anything else? Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Just wondering, construction zones.
Construction zones, yeah.
Yes, usually even for a human driver, lanes seem to go this way, but the construction seems to be going this way, and it's always like some sort of trying to figure which is the right way.
Yeah, totally.
How about self-driving cars?
So you have, it's a great question. What happened early, like if you look 2 years ago, the car would pull up to this construction zone and go, I don't know what the hell this is, and the car would say like, take over. And so the safety driver would take over, and then that car would drop what's called a DZ on that area and say no self-driving cars can go here. And so they would just block that area of the map so that all the other cars would all know don't go in that area. Over time, what's happened is the cars have gotten better and better where they can actually just drive through it. And so what you're dealing with is like a smaller and smaller amount of experiences that require a human to do something. It used to be every construction zone. Now it might be 1 out of 10 construction zones cause a problem. And eventually it gets to the point where it's no construction zones cause a problem. But yeah, there's always this long tail of use cases. And that's another example on the employment side. All of these self-driving car companies have what they call remote assistance departments. Waymo has a team of a couple, like 400 or 500 people in Austin that are agents that help the vehicles. They don't drive them, that would be pretty dangerous. But the cars will say, here's a construction zone, what should I do? And the agent can say, pull over, do a U-turn, like they can give instructions to the vehicle. And so they've built these call centers now that are growing in size and scale, that are agents who provide support to the vehicles when they're operating in the real world. Yeah.
This is a new lab business model question.
Yeah.
So from my understanding, the MIT Media Lab
Sure.
has corporations invest in the lab.
Yep.
But they don't necessarily ask them to solve a particular problem.
Yeah.
And the lab itself, but they gain capital if something in the lab
Like a
is
fund?
successful. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's more like a fund.
Yeah.
In this case, how does the lab itself fund and make money, not just the individuals that are solving the problems that corporations bring to you?
Totally. Yeah, so we make money essentially through 3 ways. One is through rent. 40% of our revenue is these companies pay us to be in the building. So that's 40% of our revenue. Then the innovation studios, they pay to run those programs, and we own 20% of the IP developed there, and 80% of the IP is owned by the entrepreneur. And then what the corporate gets is they get the first rights to invest or acquire anything that's developed in their studio. And so for a cost like an innovation studio can be about $1 million a year. That's what it costs for 2 software engineers if you want to recruit them in New York. And so the cost of that, you get a team of 40 to 50 different people from academia, from government, from entrepreneur and technology, all working on your problems. And then you get the first rights to take whatever they build, but you have to pay for it. So that's what keeps the cost low, but they have a max price they pay for the technology developed. It's slightly different model, but MIT Media Labs is a good comparison for sure. Cool. Well, thanks for sticking around. I know it's late.